What happens when a deep, personal loss crashes into ancient mysticism and the pure logic of math? Well, today, we're diving into a really unique and fascinating case study that sits right at that intersection. It's a story about grief, about faith, and about a mysterious message written in the language of geometry.
So our story really begins with this incredibly strong bond between two identical twin brothers, Mark and Darren Chard. They weren't just close, they were inseparable, even sharing diagnoses for the same serious medical conditions. But then, in December of 2020, Darren passed away, leaving his brother Mark, who's a biblical scholar, to deal with this just unimaginable loss. Then, about 6 months after his brother's death, something weird started to happen. Mark began having these really powerful visions. Now, these weren't dreams or those images you get when you're half awake, and this is the key part. They were happening while he was fully conscious, a lot of the time during prayer, and they were always, remarkably, the same.
Look, we've all heard stories of people feeling the presence of someone they've lost, but this was something else. The visions weren't emotional or personal in the way you might think, and that leads us to the big question of this whole study. What if this wasn't just his mind trying to cope with grief? What if these were something else entirely?
Okay, so let's get into the details here. Because to really get what's going on, you first have to understand just how unusual and specific these visions really are.
So right away you see this huge contrast. A typical after-death communication, or ADC, is usually deeply personal, a feeling of comfort, a reassuring message, maybe a familiar smell. The Chard case is a total outlier. The main thing he's seeing is architectural, it's mathematical, and it's completely nonverbal. It's like a message being sent not through words, but through pure shape and structure.
And this structure isn't just general, it is incredibly specific. Every single vision, for more than 5 years, has followed this exact same 3-part sequence. First, an image of Christ appears, and it always fills 3/4 of his vision. Second, his brother Darren shows up, always in that last open quadrant, the lower right, dressed in white. And only then, as a third step, does the geometry appear. These black rectangular fields filled with glowing white circles. This isn't random. It's a deeply ordered, unchanging ritual.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just a one-off thing either. These visions have been going on for over 5 years, and this is crucial. They've been evolving. They didn't just stay the same. They grew in complexity and intensity, and they did it in a very structured way.
And you can really see the progression here. It all started back in 2021. Pretty simple, just a single column of faint circles. By late 2024, it had expanded into a bunch of columns, maybe 8 to 10 of them, and the circles were brighter. And then, from late 2025 until right now, the visions became these massive, incredibly bright fields, and the circles themselves started to move with a real sense of purpose.
And this is where the case just gets so much stronger. When you break it down, you're basically turning a personal story into long-term data. Across 5 different dimensions, scale, complexity, how bright they are, movement, and how often they happen, you see this clear, directional change. What started as a simple, occasional image has turned into a frequent, complex, and dynamic experience.
So how in the world do you even start to interpret something like this? Well, the scholar Mark found an interpretive key in a place you would probably never expect. Ancient Jewish mysticism, and a figure who acts as a kind of heavenly record keeper.
And that brings us to the Enoch Metatron tradition. It's this ancient story about a human man, Enoch from the book of Genesis, who doesn't die. Instead, he's taken up and transformed into this incredibly powerful angel named Metatron. And Metatron's main gig? He's the celestial scribe, the keeper of all the heavenly records.
And the way the texts describe this transformation, wow, it is intense. This isn't some subtle change. It is a total teardown and rebuild of his entire being. The text says his flesh turns to flame, his bones to coals, his whole body to blazing fire. I mean, he is literally remade from organic flesh and blood into a being of pure light and structure.
So here's the absolute kicker. Metatron's job is, by its very nature, geometric. His whole function is to record the divine order of the universe on heavenly tablets. Now think about what that means. It means he works with fields, with columns, with rows, with ordered sequences. His very consciousness operates on a kind of sacred grid.
And this is what brings us to the central idea of the paper, where this ancient tradition and these modern visions all come together in one fascinating proposal.
The author puts forward what he calls the Scribal consciousness hypothesis. The idea is basically this. What if a human consciousness, after death, doesn't just, continue on as it was, but is actually transformed? And in that transformation, it might start to operate and even communicate in a totally new way, a structured, geometric way, a lot like the Scribal work of Metatron.
Okay, but wait, I know what you're thinking. Isn't he just seeing what he expects to see? Confirmation bias? Well, this is where the timeline becomes so important. The basic geometric visions, the rectangles, the columns of circles, they were happening consistently from June 2021. The author didn't even start his deep dive into the Metatron tradition until December of 2025, more than 4 years later. The pattern was there long before he found a framework that might explain it.
And to be fair, the author looks at all the other possibilities. Could it be a grief hallucination? Well, probably not, since the content is geometric, not emotional, and it's gotten more intense over 5 years. What about the brain just generating random patterns? Also unlikely, because the data shows this clear evolution and purposeful movement. Conceptual priming? Well, that can't be the whole story because of the timeline we just talked about. He argues that while those things might play some part, only the Scribal consciousness idea really accounts for all the data.
So, if we actually entertain this idea for a second, what does it all mean? Well, the implications are just huge. They touch on the very nature of consciousness, of reality, and what might happen to us after we die. You see, the real takeaway here isn't just that life goes on. It's that life transforms. This is really a theology of resurrection. The idea isn't that Darren is some kind of ghost, but that his consciousness has been fundamentally rewired into a new form of existence, one that sees and communicates through the very patterns and order that hold reality together. And this matters, right? It gives us a whole new way to think about these kinds of experiences that are so often just dismissed out of hand. It connects a very modern, personal experience back to an ancient spiritual tradition, and it raises these deep, profound questions about reality and information. It even suggests a real, testable research program to look into these geometric phenomena in a more systematic way.
So in the end, this whole case study leaves us with this really radical, mind-bending question. It asks us to consider a wild possibility, that consciousness itself isn't a fixed thing, that maybe after death it could be transformed from the familiar, messy flow of human thought into something else entirely, a state of being that thinks and speaks in the pure, fundamental, and beautiful language of divine geometry.